You know, you would think Paul McCartney, especially since he had been the driving force in the last few years with the Beatles, that he would have understood everything in the world about, well, his next step and how to put a band together and everything about that. But when you know the Beatle story, you know, these guys were just another garage band. They were just a group of fellas that collectively fell into place over a couple of years. First of all, it was just John and the Quarrymen, right? Basically a skiffle group with John Lennon playing 4 strings on his guitar tuned as a banjo because he was taught to play guitar with his mother, Julia. Now that's where Paul comes in and why this video is so important, all right? Paul showed up at a fete. I'm still not sure what a fete is. What, is that a block party? A block fair? But I've read all the books, so we'll call it a fete tonight. And he saw John and the Quarrymen playing. Years later, Paul would say that his most potent memory of that meeting was John's breath. You see, John had been drinking heavily. But during their break, John was introduced to Paul, who not only was a decent guitar player and good singer, and of course John could see the kid was cute, but he also knew how to tune a guitar. Now John played it cool, you see, and he said, yeah, right. But over the days, he could not forget Paul. He even said years later that he had a choice. He said either he could remain the leader of his band and go on and be able to direct the band on his own, or he could include McCartney, because he could tell at that first meeting McCartney was nobody's chump, and make the band stronger and perhaps lose a bit of power. It wasn't long before McCartney introduced John to George, a too young George. You know, when I was in a band at 16 years old and a 14-year-old came in to audition for my band, he would have lost the job immediately. But Paul kept pressing, and on a double-decker bus, they saw what George Harrison was able to do. Now, years later, Paul would catch up with George as far as being a guitar player, but at this point in their history, George Harrison was a cut above these older lads. But keep in mind, see, Paul had to make a similar decision as John. He had just gotten into the band, and he had almost co-ownership with John at that point. And there was a danger of someone who could show him up in any way, and yet, like John, Paul curtailed his ego and wanted the best player. You know, that's one of the things I love about the Beatles. You see, he wasn't just a singer who could play guitar and play in a local garage band. He, on the side, for years, had already been writing songs on his own. Hell, he wrote When I'm 64 in his early teens. And yet, he had met his match with John Lennon, who had also been writing songs on his own. And as the Beatles got their recording contract, fame in Britain, and then world fame the following year, and really until 1966, it would be John Lennon who usually dominated in the songwriting stakes. Isn't that interesting? Now, don't you even begin to think that during those early years that this was a domination as far as songwriting strength. Paul was easily matching John on every album as far as songwriting quality. But John was a madman and writing like he, well, never would again, as far as him doing it every day. And by writing more songs, his best cream of the crop would often be on most of their singles. I even gave you an example of A Hard Day's Night. He wrote 10 of the 13 songs there. Paul wrote 3, but Paul's 3 songs are equally as good as any 3 songs you want to pick out of those 10 songs by John Lennon. But by the time the Beatles were done, in the couple of years leading up to that, Paul started dominating, and it's interesting. I think that he started dominating because for the first time, he was writing every single day and John was backing off. That's what great bands do. When somebody is weakened, the others step up to the plate. And that's going to figure in to one of my upcoming videos about Led Zeppelin. I'm going to be taking a look at Presence and In Through the Outdoor, because you want to know something, folks? Those two albums are the flip side of the same coin. Now, when the Beatles finally broke up and they went their separate ways, started making their own albums, you could clearly see even Ringo was putting out stuff on Beatle level. All four of them, folks. But you wouldn't have believed that in 1970, thanks to Jan Wenner and Rolling Stone magazine and the infamous John Lennon interview. Not only that, but the fact that when Paul McCartney's RAM album came out, he put a kibosh on the writer or the reviewer who was going to give it a thumbs up and told him to write a negative review because he was in John Lennon's pocket. And there was already some feeling that he was too schmaltzy on the McCartney album. Of course, when the McCartney album came out and RAM following it, and with all the arguing with the Beatles, they would ask each individual Beatle in interviews what they thought of Paul's current album, and all three of them had nothing good to say about Paul. Backed up by Jan Wenner and Rolling Stone magazine, there became this fallacy of thinking in those days, and it did filter down to the kids in the schools. I remember clearly getting a lot of flack from most of my friends for loving the McCartney album and RAM. All of them had bought in to the bullshit. Now, somewhere between the late 80s and early 90s, audiophiles came out of the woodwork. They always seem to do that, right? And they were all of a sudden singing the McCartney album's praises, considering it a prime example, if not the first example, of lo-fi music. And of course, RAM, which probably got the most heat out of his first two albums, has been now considered to be a classic and is the favorite album for a lot of Beatle fans. Guess what, folks? It's always been my favorite Paul McCartney solo album and barely beating out the McCartney album.